Knight and Changeling, Chapter 33. Long time coming. Kevin blinked. They were standing in a dark room. Gwen wavered and he caught her as Jen made her way over to a console and clicked it on. Despite the armor, she made no sound as she moved. The sword in her hand glimmered, the Omnitrix symbol in the hilt glowing. Kevin steadied Gwen.
"Are you okay?"
She nodded, but he guided her into the nearest chair anyway. Jen smiled under her helmet. "That is a new record for you, South Dakota. Nice." Kevin frowned at her words.
"Wait, does that mean we're..."
Jen nodded. "Inside the Mount Rushmore base, yeah. We don't have long, though, probably a few minutes at best." She whirled her sword as Vilgax's voice echoed around them.
"Tennyson! You cannot escape from me!"
Gwen typed up the exterior cameras and Kevin swore as they spotted the Esoterica climbing the mountain.
"Oh, I don't like our odds."
Gwen rolled her eyes. "That's only because you never bothered to read the manual." Her fingers flew across the keys. Lasers blasted over the encroaching Esoterica, and Kevin grinned.
"I love you so much."
Gwen grinned at him. Her hands were shaking slightly, though, as Vilgax's voice echoed around them again.
"You will not escape me!"
Gwen leapt back to her feet, and she and Kevin rushed forward as the whole base creaked, but they were both blasted back as the front face of the base was ripped off. Vilgax cast aside the face of George Washington. Gwen and Kevin groaned from their spot on the floor. Jen stepped past them, whirling her sword. Vilgax laughed.
"I have the powers of a god, child. What will you do against me? What new transformation will you try? Or perhaps one of your tiresome ultimate aliens?"
Jen shook her head. "I don't need to transform this time. I have all the power I need right here." She gestured to the sword. Vilgax growled.
"Azimuth's sword will not be enough power to save you, whelp."
The two foes charged at each other as Gwen and Kevin sat up. Someone should have done this a long time ago. Jen said as she leveled the blade at Vilgax. At the last moment, she stepped to the side and drove the blade up and into Vilgax, who cried out in shock. Power rippled through the room, forcing Gwen to throw up a shield around herself and Kevin. When the light died again, they found Vilgax on the ground, holding a bleeding wound. He was no longer glowing as he had been since he'd returned from the Dagon's dimension. No, instead he looked just as he had when they had beaten him on his ship.
"You stabbed me!"
He sounded almost affronted. Jen rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be such a baby. All I did was take the Dagon's power from you." Gwen stared at her cousin. Indeed, she now glowed with godlike power that Vilgax had held up till a moment ago. Vilgax leaned back on the destroyed wall and laughed lightly. Kevin frowned.
"What are you laughing at? You lost."
Vilgax ignored him, though.
"You're an interesting creature, Jennifer Tennyson. You hold all power in your hands. The Ultimatrix, Azimuth's sword, the powers of the Dagon, at your fingertips. What will you do with it?"
Jen blinked, seeming to only now realize that he was right. She lifted a glowing hand, seeming to examine it. Gwen stepped forward, but Vilgax wasn't finished talking.
"You and I are very much alike. We mold the world around us to suit ourselves. Use the power, Gen 10.
But he got no further. Kevin had absorbed the stone of the mountain and smashed a fist into his head.
"Shut the fuck up,"
he told the unconscious, bleeding figure before turning back to Jen, who still hadn't spoken. "Jen?" Gwen asked, her voice full of trepidation, as if she was unsure what her cousin would do next. Green met green as Jen looked up at her cousin. "He's right about one thing. I do have the power." She raised the sword, which glowed white. Gwen threw up an arm to cover her eyes. Kevin grabbed hold of her, holding on, worried about what would happen when the light cleared. But within a moment, the light died. Kevin blinked around. Nothing had changed. Gwen laughed, one hand to her head.
What? What happened?
She was grinning. Jen answered his question. I fixed what the Dagon did. I turned everyone on Earth back into themselves. I put right what George took too, the way he wanted it to be. But I'd like it if that stayed between us. There is something else I have to do too. Gwen frowned as Jen sheathed the blade, the glow of the Dagon's power vanishing with the armor. The blade hung innocently at her side. All anyone needs to know is that we won. She pulled a pair of cuffs from thin air and fixed them around Vilgax's wrists as the comms crackled to life.
This is Magister Tennyson putting out a general call. All plumbers who are able, check in now.
Gwen stepped over to the console and pulled her badge from her pocket. This is Agent Tennyson, checking in.
Agent Levin, too.
Kevin said, stepping up next to her.
Gwen, Kevin, what the hell happened?
They glanced at each other. It's a long story, Grandpa. Jen's here, too. Gwen glanced over her shoulder, but her cousin had vanished. Kevin pointed to another console. A ship was taking off.
She did say she had something else to do,
he said. Gwen rolled her eyes. Scratch that, Grandpa. She just took off in a ship heading off planet. No idea where she's going, but we've got Vilgax here, tied up and ready for prison transport to the Null Void. Max sighed.
So, we won?
Gwen nodded. That's one way of putting it. I'm sure she'll tell you the whole story when she gets back. Max sighed.
I'm sure she will. I'm sending a team to your location to pick up Vilgax. Head home with them once that's done.
They nodded. Kevin took Gwen's hand. He smiled at her. She pulled him into a kiss. Jen pulled into Primus's atmosphere and smiled as she stepped out of the ship. She could feel the planet reacting to her presence, the trees parting to guide her way to the place she needed to go. She smiled as she stepped up to the one standing structure on the planet. It was a large building, big enough to house the larger of Azimuth's assistants. She was met at the door by Eunice, who grinned and hugged her. It's good to see you, Jen. She smiled. You too, Eunice, but is he here? The blonde nodded. He is. He says he's been expecting you. Jen laughed lightly. He would. She stepped past Eunice and into the main lab. Azimuth was sitting in the lab and smiling at her. I see you've taken up Ascalon. Jen nodded, drawing the sword but keeping the point down. Yes, and defeated the Dagon with it. Took its power from Vilgax, who stole it in the first place. Azimuth nodded. What will you do with it now? I've already done all I wanted with it. Now I don't need the Dagon's power. I don't want it. The safest place for the sword is back with its creator and the power that goes with it. Azimuth shook his head. That is the reason I know you are worthy of it. But if you insist, I will destroy the sword and the power along with it. Is that what you want? Jen nodded. It's too much for any one being to have. Azimuth smiled. You've grown so much since I first met you. Set the sword down here. She nodded and followed his instruction. The device closed around the sword, and Jen watched as it atomized in a flash of light. She turned to leave, but Azimuth spoke again. Before you go, I have something for you. Jen frowned as she turned back to him. He nodded to a box on the table. She stepped over to it and paused. He nodded again. Open it. She tapped a finger on the box, which reacted, and gasped at the item inside. It was a brand new Omnitrix, slimmer and sleeker than the original model, with a white band instead of a black one. Why? Because you're finally ready for the finished Omnitrix. The one you stumbled upon 6 years ago was a prototype. The Ultimatrix was an improvement on that prototype, but never the finished device. You're ready for the real one. Jen smiled and nodded as Azimuth hopped over to her and picked up the finished Omnitrix. With a quick spin to the dial of the Ultimatrix, it fell to the ground, quickly replaced with the new device, Jen stumbled slightly as the power from Master Control faded and breathed out as Azimuth placed the Ultimatrix in the same device that had destroyed Ascalon. She watched as it, too, vanished from existence. She smiled lightly at Azimuth. "Don't suppose I could convince you to give me back Master Control." Azimuth laughed. "I'll let you figure it out on your own this time." Jen laughed loudly. Azimuth smiled at her. Chapter 34. The More Things Change. Jen arrived back on Earth the next day to a party. The final preparations for Earth becoming an open system had gone through at last. The countries of the world were coming together to gradually introduce this to the world, most of whom already knew about aliens from everything that had happened. The plumbers were celebrating another planet joining them in the free planets of the universe. Before anyone knew what was happening, the final weekend of July was upon them, and Pierce, Jen, Gwen, and Kevin headed to the end of summer festival. Ken greeted them with hugs all around. He introduced Pierce and Kevin to the other members of his band, a girl, their bass guitarist, and the drummer. Ken himself was lead vocals and guitar. They had a spot backstage where they could watch everything that was happening. Pierce grinned. "I've never been to a concert before." Jen grinned at him. "I kind of figured." They smiled and danced and partied the night away. Once Volume 10 took the stage, they were well into the night. Ken had hinted to Gwen and Jen that he might pull them on stage to help him sing the final song of the night. One, they had all grown up singing together, so it didn't come as a surprise when he pulled the girls out on stage to riotous applause. The final song went off without a hitch, and the crowd cheered so loudly it shook the stage as they went off. They grinned at each other as Ken and his band treated them to dinner after the festival. The next morning found them having breakfast with Gwen's parents.
"I'm so proud of you, Gwen,"
her father said, lifting his coffee.
"Cheers to you graduating early."
They all raised their glasses. Jen was feeling a bit melancholy. This was the end of an era. At the end of this breakfast, Gwen and Kevin would be driving away, off to Gwen's college on the other side of the country. Jen smiled as they all raised their glasses. She frowned as her comm unit beeped. "Excuse me." She stepped away from the table and pulled the comm unit out of her shirt. "Hello?"
"Jen, Zombozo's been spotted breaking into the brain bank on 6th. I wouldn't have interrupted, but..."
Jen nodded. "No, I get it. Thanks, Pierce. I'll head out after him in a minute."
I'll tell the cleanup crew to know you...
I'll let the cleanup teams know to be ready for your call." Jen nodded and headed back to the table. "Hey guys, bad guy on the loose. I gotta run." She pulled Gwen into a hug. Gwen pulled back slightly.
"Do you want us to come with you?"
Jen shook her head and reached out to shake Kevin's hand. He scoffed and pulled her into a hug, giving her a quick noogie. "No, I can handle it. I'll be on my own from here on out, so I better get used to it." She grinned and waved at her aunt and uncle as she ran off. Kevin pulled Gwen into his arms.
"Yeah, joke's on her. Her new partner lands today."
Gwen laughed at her boyfriend. Everything was going to change now. But maybe that would be for the best.